Friends, colleagues, we're moving on to our second inaugural address, Professor Joanna Newman. And the second testimonial speaker is Professor Adam Sutcliffe. Adam Sutcliffe is Professor of European History at King's College London, where he has taught since 2005. He worked closely with Joanna while she was VP International at King's, and he was head of the Department of History at that point. His research focuses on the early modern and modern history of social and cultural thought and of Jewish, non-Jewish relations. He's the author, most recently, of What Are Jews For? History, Peoplehood and Purpose, and the co-editor of the Cambridge History of Judaism, and History, Memory and Public Life, the Past in the Present. He currently is working on a history of the ideas of historical empathy from the 18th century to the present. And so, Adam Sutcliffe, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everybody. It's really a great honor to be here to introduce my former colleague, Joanna Newman, and to whet your appetite for what I am sure will be an absolutely fascinating and stimulating lecture from her in a very few minutes. So I've known Joanna for 11 years now. It was 11 years ago that Joanna came to King's, where, as Adam said, at the time I was serving as head of the history department. And I worked quite closely with her on a number of things, but in particular there was one very challenging collaborative project. I won't name it. She knows which one I'm referring to, that she led on. And it was through that, above all, that I had the privilege of seeing what an extremely skilled, extraordinarily skilled academic leader she is. However intractable the problem that we were facing seemed to be, and a number of those problems seemed absolutely intractable to my limited vision, Joanna approached those issues calmly and clearly, and she found a productive way forward, somehow almost effortlessly it appeared, and I was in awe, and I learned so much from her, watching her do that. And I was also delighted when Joanna responded very enthusiastically to my suggestion that she became part of the history department and did some teaching for us. And she was a huge hit, both with our master's students and our undergraduate students. And she gave each year a lecture on a circus module, as we call it, a compulsory second-year module with about 10 different lecturers contributing. The module was on history and memory. She gave a lecture on refugees in modern memory, policy and law, which brilliantly did what she does, which was to connect her historical expertise with issues of contemporary politics and policy. And as I was convener of the module, I saw the feedback from students, the evaluations, and Joanna regularly came top among the 10 or 12 lecturers in terms of the positive feedback from students to that lecture. Now, some of you here, I'm sure, tonight have known Joanna much longer than my 14 years, such as my good friend Tony Kushner. Where is Tony? I know he's here, as I saw him beforehand. There he is, who supervised Joanna's PhD thesis at the University of Southampton in the 1990s. Now, Tony, for those of you who don't know, is a PhD supervisor extraordinaire. Many of his former students have gone on to do innovative and exciting things, bringing together their historical knowledge and specialism with a political commitment to social justice. And it's that combining of history with making the world a better place that's really the hallmark of the Kushner School of History. So many have taken Tony's inspiration forward, but I don't think any of them have done it with as much impact as Joanna, who has played a truly major role in her career in bringing universities across the world together in order to have a more positive impact on the world. That's how I would summarise, as I see it, what Joanna's career has been about and is today still about. And perhaps most notably in that role was her post in the 6 years between leaving King's and coming to SOAS a few years ago, when she was chief executive of the Association of Commonwealth Universities. So, going back to Tony, I asked Tony for his early memories of Joanna, whether he saw in that youthful PhD students this future promise. And he called to mind a day out on the beach in Weymouth in the late 1990s with his wife and their, at the time, 2-year-old son, Jack. And this was to celebrate Joanna's completion of her PhD. Joanna decided she would give the parents a little bit of a rest and take Jack for a paddle in the sea. Wonderful idea. Tony pointed out that there were no changes of clothes for little Jack, so very important that he shouldn't get wet beyond really the soles of his feet. So off they went, and when they come back, Jack was beamingly happy and entirely soaked from head to foot. So it was from that moment, Tony says, that it became clear to him that Joanna was eminently suited to run Britain's universities. And that's what she's now doing. And somehow, at the same time as running universities, Joanna has managed to find time to take forward her really important academic scholarship, which began in the PhD in Southampton in her field of refugee history. And her expertise fits wonderfully together with what we've just been hearing about from Professor Laura Hammond. I really commend to all of you Joanna's book, which is titled Nearly the New World, The British West Indies and the Escape from Nazism, 1933 to 1945, which came out in 2019. It builds on the PhD, and it's a meticulously researched and captivatingly presented study of the experiences of European Jews in that calamitous period who sought refuge in the Caribbean. It also covers the responses to those refugees from Caribbean communities and governments, and it covers the legal battles and humanitarian activism that were part of that story. Over the past decade or so, she's published more widely on that topic, and she's always taken forward her interest, going back to the school of Tony Kushner history, her interest in how her expertise, that particular history especially, might illuminate our understanding and our response to more recent refugee crises, including the refugee crises that we are facing right now in the world today. And it's that connection of past to present that Joanna is going to speak to us now, so I don't want to take a second more of your time standing between myself and the lecture. Please welcome Professor Joanna Newman, who is going to speak to the title Bound for Nowhere, History, Migration and Refugees.
Well, that anecdote from Tony was actually very, very safe. So I'm very relieved that there were many others that could have been said and that weren't. But thank you, Adam, very much for your kind words. And it is absolutely wonderful, as Laura said, it's fantastic to be in a room filled with friends, family, colleagues, many of whom I've worked with for many, many years. And so it is a bringing together tonight, I think, of the sum of my experience and the experience of working with you. And as Laura said too, you've all been part of who I am today. And I'm incredibly grateful to all of you. I also wanted to talk a little bit about Tony, actually, at the beginning, because he is probably the preeminent Anglo-Jewish historian, and his works on refugees in the age of genocide, but most notably the Holocaust and the liberal imagination, is probably the seminal work on the responses of the West to the attempted destruction of European Jewry. And Tony was the most amazing supervisor at Southampton, where I came as a mature student. I'd been at Middlesex Polytechnic as a mature student. Some of you might not have known that the sweet life of academia came after a spell working in the music business for the Eurythmics. So I came newly minted from the most international undergraduate degree, which at the time was truly international and truly about the majoritarian world, in a time when most humanities degrees would have been European in scope. So I'm also extremely grateful to Middlesex, then Polytechnic, now University. I'm also very grateful to the librarians and archivists at the Hartley Library. I managed to get a Parkes Institute scholarship, and that has meant a huge amount to me that I was a university scholar. And I cut my teeth in the Hartley Library with the newly deposited archival material there from refugee organisations of the 30s, like the Chief Rabbi's Religious Emergency Fund. And going through that raw archival material at a time when it was still being indexed was the making of me, I think, as a historian. And one of the themes running through this lecture will be, why does history matter? And one reason that it might do is that it's been a very useful career path. Tony has not only been a fantastic supervisor, but of his supervisees, I'm one of 2 deputy vice-chancellors he's produced, as well as probably much more importantly for the discipline, many, many history professors, including Donald Bloxham, Gavin Schaffer, James Jordan, and friends such as Jo Riley, whose book on Belson was written as a result of her PhD. My own interest in history and studying history did start with the personal, trying to make sense of the refugee history of my father's family. My father was a small boy when he arrived in the UK on a boat from Germany with 2 grandparents, 2 grandmothers, and his mother and his brother. His mother had been a fashion writer and artist in Berlin, and only as a young adult myself did I realise when talking to her the immense trauma that moving countries inflicted on her and the family, compounded by the knowledge of the luck and guilt they felt, common in refugees, that they had survived at all, given what happened to Jews unable to leave Nazi-occupied Europe. Indeed, gratitude to Britain as a country of refuge was an understandable reaction from her and many other refugees, both from that time and in subsequent movements. And that tradition was celebrated in 1965 when the British Academy and the Anglo-Jewish Refugee Association created something called the Thank You Britain Fund, which I became aware of when Tony told me to apply for a grant there when I was doing my PhD. So we haven't quite established whether the fund is still going or whether it's been wound up. But the fund's patrons were the Academy, the president of the fund was Lionel Robbins, the Academy's president, famous for the Robbins Report on Higher Education, and Isaiah Berlin, a member of its council, as well as 3 former refugees, the Nobel Prize-winning scientists Ernst Heim and Hans Krebs, and the spinal injuries specialist Ludwig Gutmann. Some 4,500 people contributed to the fund, the vast majority of them Jewish refugees. The gratitude expressed in the name of the fund was an echo of the language used in a pamphlet issued to newly arrived refugees by the Anglo-Jewish Committee. I've always enjoyed reading this. It advised refugees to do all in their power to show loyalty to Britain and the Commonwealth, to refrain from speaking German in the streets, and to talk halting English rather than fluent German, and do not talk in a loud voice. I'm told that this advice is still given to newly arrived refugees, possibly not the German. Somewhere behind the pragmatic counsel then and now is a warning that the public will see a refugee with a foreign accent as someone who may not show loyalty to Britain, who may have dual loyalties and may be untrustworthy. This, of course, was the case once Britain went to war and many refugees were interned. In the 1960s, when the fund was launched, Anglo-Jewish historiography was characterised by a focus on the accomplishments of the Jewish community. And by the time I started my PhD, a new generation of scholars placed the history of Jews in Britain, relations between Jews and non-Jews, and British policy towards minorities in a far more critical light. Indeed, Tony and David Cesarani, tragically no longer with us, were called Young Turks by the slightly antiquarian Jewish Historical Society of Great Britain, which I briefly became secretary to. And they looked at the established community's response to the wave of Eastern European incomers over the turn of the century to the First World War, to see how the response of the Anglo-Jewish community revealed anxiety about their own status, as they used philanthropy, politics and education to, most famously in the words of the charity the Jewish Lads Brigade, iron out the ghetto bend and ensure conformity. In an article commemorating David Cesarani, the historian Bernard Wasserstein wrote that Cesarani was the leading figure in a new wave of Anglo-Jewish historians, alongside Tony Kushner, who shed the apologetic stance of many of their predecessors. They were no longer interested in chronicling the contributions of Jews to British culture and society, nor in celebrating the relatively tolerant welcome that Jews encountered in the country. Instead, they tried to fashion a more critical and realistic view of British attitudes towards Jews in the modern period and the dynamic interactions of Jews with non-Jews. I hope that at SOAS, I will be able to contribute to this approach to minority history. Beyond national history, I think that the study of transnational history, of forced and voluntary global migration, of diasporic communities, contributes a historical understanding of the context in which we live today and stands as a challenge and correction to those nationalist ideologies that build walls against people and ideas. While the Thank You Britain Fund was created as a genuine gesture, it also helped to reinforce an image of Britain's record towards refugees as generous. Perhaps the most prominent example of this tendency is the story of the Kindertransport, the granting of block visas, which enabled some 10,000 unaccompanied children to Britain before the outbreak of the war. And here are some images. There's a quite famous black and white image of children arriving in Liverpool Street Station. Here's an image of the bronze memorial to those children in Liverpool Street Station. And then just to give you an idea of how much it caught the public imagination, here are some of the books and films that have been made and continue to be made since. I have a whole lecture on the Kindertransport and the knighting of Sir Nicholas Winton and the whole way that it's been memorialised, but we don't have time for that now. But I think the reason I wanted to bring this as an example is that this episode has been mobilised so many times since to counter criticism of Britain's refugee record. Whilst there is truth in the assertion that this was an initiative that Britain could be proud of, particularly since a similar proposal in the US was blocked, the real situation was far more complex and nuanced than it usually appears. For 2/3 of the 10,000 children came to Britain as unaccompanied, not because at the time they were orphaned, but because they had to leave their parents and families behind. And as Louise London, a colleague, has said in Whitehall and the Jews, a gulf exists between the memory and history of that record. British kindness towards refugees is remembered fondly by those who gave generously, and the refugees who benefited from such kindness. We remember the touching photographs and newsreel footage of unaccompanied Jewish children arriving on the Kindertransports. There are no such photographs of the Jewish parents left behind in Nazi Europe, and their fate has made a minimal impact. And more recent research has also discussed the uncomfortable fact that it was much easier for refugee organisations on the ground, a mix of church, Quaker, Jewish and other groups, to place young female children rather than older children or boys. And so while it was a process to save lives, it was a selective process. Undeniably, the block granting of visas was enabled because of a public horrified by images that they saw and reporting in newspapers of the Kristallnacht, the burning of synagogues across Germany in November 1938. And there was a public pressure for the government to act. But the actual record is of parents having to face the agonising choice of parting from their children in circumstances of extreme peril, and of many children who never saw their parents again. These details matter, and only through proper historical analysis is the veneer of years of image building stripped off and the painful reality of the mythology revealed. This mythology is often used in making the case against immigration, comparing the Kinder as real refugees against bogus claims today. If we look at the current UNHCR statistics, you can see that since the Second World War, the number of refugees and displaced people in the world has multiplied to a staggering 122 million. 68 internally displaced and 37 million are refugees. And you can also see that the majority of those who are able to leave one region for another are hosted, the refugees, in countries very near conflicts, and these countries take in far larger percentages of refugees than Western countries which would have more resources. Jordan and Lebanon are two very good examples of that. Whilst the example of the Kindertransport has been mythologized for political ends, there are other historical parallels to explore between the 1930s and today. An infamous symbol of the West's failure to provide refuge in the 30s is the Evian Conference. Called by President Roosevelt in the summer of 1938 at a spa town in Evian-le-Bain, the consensus among historians is that it was a dismal failure. Only one country, the Dominican Republic, famously offered to allow Jews fleeing Nazi Germany the opportunity to enter the country, and then only to have access to the SOAS settlement as agricultural workers. Far from offering the hoped-for sanctuary, each participating country at Evian related its existing record in admitting refugees, and all stated that no change would be made to existing immigration regulations. After the conference, this image printed in the Times exemplifies the plight of Jewish refugees trying to leave Germany with absolutely nowhere obvious for them to go. And the feedback from organisations giving evidence at Evian was that not only were they given very little time allotted to give evidence to the governments who gathered there, but they were also diverted by requests to fund investigations into increasingly bizarre settlement schemes dreamed up by Roosevelt's President's Advisory Committee on Political Refugees, included Alaska, the Mindanao, Kimberley region in Australia, anywhere that was completely remote and difficult to get to and would not have suited elderly urban refugee populations. And this was particularly burdensome for an organisation that I had done quite a lot of research on, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which was an organisation set up temporarily to help Hoover's relief effort during the First World War, and then found itself to be the major financial vehicle for channeling American Jewry's aid to Jewish communities by the 30s. Commenting on these schemes in April 1939 at a committee meeting, Cecilia Rozovsky, one of the most senior JDC officials at the time, clearly couldn't hide her frustration and said, "There isn't a day we don't get letters from communities in all parts of the country insisting that we put Jews on the land, and they're really indignant because we seem to pass over their suggestions. It seems to me that a statement needs to be worked out, would be helpful in educating the Jewish population in the United States. They say they don't want them in the cities, put them on the land." Parts of the British Empire did provide at least temporary havens, but because of unintentionally lax immigration regulations rather than encourage migration. Wartime exceptions were only when Britain wanted to place refugees or internees in different parts of the empire, and that happened during the war. The proposed land settlement schemes were never really intended for mass refuge and were put on the table by cynical administrations unwilling to open their borders and blind to the unsuitability for refugees in under-resourced and remote destinations. Part of the title of this talk, Bound for Nowhere, Disorganised Panic Migration, was a report written by Cecilia Rozovsky in March 1939 for the JDC. It described a world where emigration prospects were narrowing dramatically and Nazi emigration policy was brutal, with Jews expelled onto boats on the high seas without valid travel documents. Rozovsky described these refugee boats as bound for nowhere and floating no man's lands, as they travelled from port to port but were refused sanctuary. The most famous case where the JDC intervened was of the St. Louis, bound for Havana from Hamburg in June 1939 with 937 refugees on board. Despite having valid visas, the Cuban government changed its mind, and when the ship neared the port, refused them entry. After a long series of negotiations, the ship turned back to Europe, where the passengers were allowed to disembark in Britain, France, and the Netherlands. Ultimately, 254 of those passengers lost their life during the Holocaust. I'm currently really interested in reviewing the role that agencies such as the JDC played in the refugee crisis, how they managed their finances, how they were at a time when we didn't have the 1951 UN Convention, we didn't have the 68 Protocol. It was completely reliant on private organisations, how they actually managed to do have the impact that they had. And as my research has uncovered, it was by no means, St. Louis was by no means the only journey where the outcome was partly dependent on refugee agencies negotiating entry and providing financial guarantees. Looking at their financial history, for example, there was 14% in 1939 spent in countries like Poland, but by 1940, 3 times that amount was being spent on helping emergency migration. And not only were they providing the money to help fund refugees on boats, but they were also called upon. So wherever they were successful in enabling refugee ships to land and negotiate landing, whether it was temporary or permanent, they were also called on to provide the financial guarantees. So, for example, for the St. Louis, they spent over 4 million to Belgium, France, England, and Holland with temporary financial guarantees. Given this was before the outbreak of war, when Nazi Jewish policy was on expulsion, it's really understandable refugee agencies wanted to prevent what they called as panic migration. And so while nevertheless sounding the alarm and meeting the acute need for safe havens, they were walking a tightrope. And there is a telegram which has always struck me as extremely poignant because it characterises a dilemma that they had at the time, and that without the hindsight of history, would have meant that they basically considered whether they needed to stop helping refugees at sea because they saw it as blackmail, and they felt that perhaps by not helping them, Germany would stop expelling their refugees and other countries would take them. And so this telegram talks about the unscrupulous steamship agencies, lawyers and venal officials with the so-called dumping being carried out on the assumption that they, Jewish organisations, would be blackmailed into paying. And so the telegram actually asked for a common policy on this. I don't think they ever reached one. They did as refugee agencies do today. They helped people at sea and they helped them try to find safe havens. Today, the UNHCR's protection at sea does intervene, but the parallels as well as the differences between the situation facing the JDC in the 30s and 40s and the situation facing agencies today are striking. And this was brought up by Zaid al-Hussein, who was the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who spoke in 2017 during the Syrian crisis, and he warned that the language that was being used about refugees and migrants today reminded him of the inhuman language used around the time of the Evian conference, and he called it up specifically in an interview with Christine Amanpour for CNN. Christine Amanpour, it could be today, but it was actually in 2017, said, well, all European countries, or a lot of them anyway, are faced with this very unsettling rise of xenophobic, racist, anti-immigrant parties, which have done well in European elections and threaten to do well in national elections in some of our countries. How worried are you as Human Rights Commissioner about that eventuality? Hussein replied, well, I think the exploitation by populist leaders in various countries of this issue is shameful. One need only recall that across the lake from where we're sitting, Hitler wanted to and was proposing deporting the Jewish population. There was a meeting in Evian in 1938, and the countries attending all refused to accept any movement of Jewry into their countries, some saying they didn't want to import a racial problem. And of course then the Holocaust followed. I think we have to be mindful of history. We have to be mindful of exploiting these poor people who've lost everything in many cases and view them as if they're not human, as if they don't have the rights that we all have. We cannot replace scenes from the 20th century. No longer do we find this acceptable. In all, I've estimated some 100,000 refugees gained sanctuary across Central and South America and Caribbean destinations. And whilst press and official records provide some information, in many cases the fullest accounts of the refugees' journeys and their attempts to set up new lives, the disruption that internment caused to some, and their attempts to move on, are most fully documented in refugee archives, because it was to these organisations that most turned. It's notable to think that whilst many did move on, at least 20 years before the Windrush generation came to Britain, Jewish refugees from Europe settled across the Caribbean and were welcomed there. Their stories are tremendously illuminating. The story of the Tauscher family, for example, seen here in Trinidad with their Trinidadian neighbour and child posing in the garden with their chickens, transforms the conventional view of refugee history. The Tauscher family, from left to right, Erich, Alice, Berta, Trude and Victor Stetcher fled Austria by train to Amsterdam on November the 24th, 1938. From there, they sailed on the Simon Bolivar to Trinidad. I met Victor's son, Hans, when I visited Trinidad for my research. He came as a young boy and had found the journey a huge adventure, and it reminded him of the Ernst May adventure books that he read as a boy. In general, those who came as children or young adults had far more ability to adapt to their new circumstances. Older refugees, particularly once they had been interned, despaired and were unable to build new lives. Many, including the Tausches, moved on, but Hans remained in Trinidad, where he had a successful dry goods business. He was eventually the guardian of the Jewish cemetery in Port of Spain. That's Hans standing in front of the grave of his father, Victor Stetcher, and his aunt, Wilhelmina Bilonesta, who was a writer. The story of the Tausches is known, but I have not yet found out who their neighbours, the Trinidadian woman and child, are. But I do know that they were part of communities that, despite their own hardship, welcomed European refugees in their midst. There is, in fact, a wealth of information and sources on how West Indians responded to refugees on the cusp of post-war independence, during a period of poverty and labour disputes for equal rights, where the future leaders of the Caribbean were demanding change. West Indians responded to refugees in calypsos, in school debates, or, as Marcus Garvey did, by expressing both sympathy for their plight and disapproval of British plans to involve Jewish refugees in another mass settlement plan for British Guyana. Underlying any study of immigration and refugee flight during this period is a question about why countries were so reluctant to allow a relatively small number of Jewish refugees to enter. About 2/3 of German Jews did manage to emigrate, while the majority of European Jewry living in Eastern Europe were unable to escape the Holocaust. Behind nearly all the failed asylum schemes and reluctance to open doors was the belief in the 1930s that acting with generosity would encourage other states such as Poland or Romania to choose to expel their Jewish population. And as it is today, this belief was also born out of a political belief that the mass migration, or even limited migration, of minorities into Britain and other countries is undesirable. The concept of aliens, enshrined in the 1905 Aliens Act and developed during the Second World War with the concepts of friendly and unfriendly or enemy aliens, has contributed to a persistently negative perception of immigration. In the history of anti-Semitism, both political and religious, with its roots many centuries ago, one finds, I think, the roots of much of the xenophobia and anti-immigrant feeling that we see today. The language of the popular press has also not seen very much change. And here you have the Daily Mail from 1934 and from 2011, and you can see the headlines against asylum seekers the language hasn't really changed much. Possibly it's the same staff writer who's had a long life. The post-war consensus that arose from the plight of the many millions of displaced persons across the world is breaking down. Calls in the UK to leave the European Court of Human Rights are only part of a new isolationism that has yet to reveal its full effects. The lessons of history, it seems, are all too quickly forgotten. The title of this talk also alludes to the fact that the history of refugees, of migration, of transmigration are relatively new areas for history degrees. In 2017, Peter Gattrell, in an article, Refugees, What's Wrong with History, suggests that although a handful of historians have contributed greatly to our understanding of mass population displacement, much more remains to be done, not only in terms of specialist studies, but in relation to history generally. And his title also implies, or he asked, that why many social scientists working in refugee studies are yet to be convinced of the benefits of thinking historically. So that's a challenge to bring to SOAS. Tony Kushner also recently observed that even within the narrower field of refugee studies, the discipline of history remains marginal, and that if refugee studies is still relatively marginal within academia, then the historical study of refugees continues to suffer a double liminality. So why study history if an issue of such importance and huge contemporary relevance is widely neglected? SOAS is a community which attracts students and staff from all over the world. Many of our undergraduates are from diasporic communities that have strong connections with Asia, Africa and the Middle East, and are drawn to SOAS because we describe and talk about the world through that lens. And as Laura said earlier, everyone comes and goes from somewhere. Many of the journeys that our students' families would have taken to come to Britain are part of a history that is not taught at school in mainstream subject pathways. Yet transnational history is inextricably woven into the human condition because it traces the connectedness of our world, the human connections through trade, through war, through migration that go beyond the narrow confines of most history curriculums. Yes, there's now an option on migration in History A-level, but that's surely barely adequate to the case. So in the light of all of this, I would argue that history has never mattered more than it does today. Many of the Kindertransportees who came to Britain rose to huge prominence, and there's a list of them there. I sit on the board of the Council for At-Risk Academics, and I could show you a list of refugee scholars from Syria, Afghanistan, Ukraine, Palestine, Sudan, who would make an equal contribution. Now isn't the time to turn our backs on refugees and tighten borders. In fact, there's never been such a time. At his commencement address at Washington University in St. Louis in 2011, Elie Wiesel very famously said, "Today, as yesterday, a nation is judged by its attitude to refugees." The contemporary relevance of that observation needs no further elucidation from me. Thank you.
What a poignant address, and what a chilling message that we, as a collective humanity, have not learned the lessons 80 years later. The same problems, the same pictures. The chilling rhetoric is so similar that it's something that we have to redouble our efforts, it seems to me, not only as academics, but as human beings, to start learning the lessons so that we don't destroy ourselves as a species. If we don't learn to live together as a common humanity, we will not survive as a human species. I'm not going to say more anymore. We've had two magnificent addresses, except to say that both addresses tell the story of people who are too easily ignored. And they convert ideas, they are about converting ideas into action. And they ultimately about creating an inclusive, fairer world. And that ultimately is not only the mission of SOAS, it should be the mission of universities around the world. They are meant to create, if you like, a new cohort of professionals and graduates who can go out there to make sure that we don't repeat the tragedies of our past. And I don't think that anybody could have done a more magnificent job than our two scholars to telling that story and to bringing that to the fore. So ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, thank you very much for coming this evening. And please join us for the reception outside. And a round of applause for our magnificent inaugural address.